we'll get started. I think people can join us late if they need to, but it seems like we have a good crowd. So let's get rolling if we could. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for joining us either in the middle of your day or perhaps in the early evening, or if you're on the West Coast of the US or something like that, I guess in the morning. But we appreciate you taking time to be with us. My name is Joel Obermeyer. I'm the Executive Director of Widen the Circle. And I'm just really excited about today's event about the power of remembrance, because to me, it's about kind of what we're thinking about is really a critical challenge, teaching students about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, particularly when those students come from communities that have suffered trauma of their own or they're marginalized in some other way. I think it's a very important, very relevant topic, both in Germany and the United States. And we have two superstars to join the conversation. Sorry for setting the bar high, Zabet and Steve, but let's have you guys join me if we can on screen. So I want to welcome my two guests. First is Zabet Schmidhals, who is a gymnasium history teacher in Berlin. I usually say high school. I realize they're not the same thing. We Americans get those things confused sometimes. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us. She's an Obermeyer Award winner who works with mainly with students from immigrant families. She won an Obermeyer Award in 2020, and Zabet is joining us from Berlin. Hello.
Hi.
Good.
Hi.
And then the dapper guy who is also on the screen with me now is Dr. Stephen Beckton. I'm going to call you Steve the rest of time, Steve, but I'm going to start with Dr. Beckton. Steve is the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Facing History in Ourselves. Steve has also spent many years as a classroom teacher in Tennessee. And both of those things I think are very relevant to this conversation. Also, Steve is joining us from Memphis, Tennessee. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
Good to have you here. So before we get started, I have a couple things to do. We are going to hear from our guests because they're both fascinating what they've been up to. And we'll have some question and answers after we hear a little bit from them. And we may pause very briefly at the end of the hour for folks who might need to move on, but I've asked both the guests to stay on a little bit longer to be available for extra questions if there are extra questions. So please stick around if it's something that you can do. And generally speaking, one of my colleagues will be watching the chat for questions. Mostly we'll go to questions at the end, but if you have a question or comment, feel free to chat away and we will take it from there. So just to get us started, Steve and Zabet, I'll come back to you in a second. I'm just going to give a quick introduction about Widen the Circle so we can get to the interesting stuff. So Widen the Circle has offices in the United States and Germany, and we work with people who uncover local history. That's history related to oppression and bigotry, particularly Jewish history and the Holocaust in Germany, and things like the legacy of slavery here in the United States. And we use the lessons of that history to create a more just world today. We have 3 programs. Many of you are aware of some of them, but I'll say them anyway. We give out Obermeyer Awards at the Berlin Parliament each year. They honor activists and educators who are preserving pieces of Jewish history and culture in Germany and using lessons from that history to fight modern prejudice and bigotry. Second, Widen the Circle has developed and nurtured a network of German activists who do remembrance projects and use remembrance to fight modern prejudice in Germany. And we have quite a robust network. And Zabet, who we'll talk to, is part of the network, and Steve has interacted with it some. So we both have a sense of that. And then the third area, Widen the Circle builds bridges among educators and activists and thought leaders in the United States and Germany who are dealing with historic legacies and injustice. We bring them together so that they can learn from one another. We bring them together so that we can learn from what they can learn from one another. And we do this through virtual events like this one. We also particularly do this in an immersive education program called the Visiting Program that brings Americans to Germany each June. We have a new cohort of the Visiting Program starting this June. Zabet, and we were lucky enough to have both Zabet and Steve on the cohort last June. So our guests met one another on the Visiting Program this past June. They're both teachers and both work with students from marginalized communities. And rather than hear more from me, I think we should talk with them. So we're going to start with Zabet. let's get her back on screen. I'll start the introduction anyway. I'll give a little bit of background, but let's pull her up here. There we go. So Zabet Schmidhals is a gymnasium teacher, which for Americans means high school age. Yeah, I see the eyebrows rise there in Berlin. She won an Obermeyer Award in 2020 for work she does on local history issues with her students and alumni. Her students come mainly from a working class neighborhood, and many come from immigrant or refugee families, particularly from the Middle East and Africa, although, you know, a broad range. I'm going to summarize very briefly part of Zabet's innovative approach that she developed over many years with agreement from Zabet. And the idea is that way she can talk about some things that have come up more recently. So I'm just going to give a quick little summary here, Zabet. Let's see if I get it right. So Zabet's approach is about empathy. The idea that if you empathize with a student's personal story, they're more likely to empathize with the stories of others. And 3 of the main elements of this approach involve understanding in a deep way stories where students actually exchange their own family story with one another as a way to begin to think about the history. Second element is about making it very local. So learning about history of people who lived in the neighborhood of the school, so that students can really relate and see it. And then the third is to revolve around stories of individual people. Did I get that right so far, Zabet? Yeah, okay, cool, that's always good. And just one last thing, and we'll jump in, which is that, you know, her students have gotten involved, she and her students have gotten involved in the creation of a small memorial across the street from her school. It's at a train depot called Track 69, and we're going to pull up the track now. I think Rebecca will show the track, where more than 30,000 Jews were deported during the war. This is the entrance to the memorial now. I want to see the actual track. There we go. And now Zabet's student and alumni do nearly all of or much of the commemorative work at the memorial. They've also traveled to several other countries where they look into Holocaust era history and Jewish history, while also considering connections to modern issues. Zabet has continued to work with both students and alumni through an after-school organization you would call a working group. At least that's what you would call in Germany. So Zabet, hopefully we're good to go. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. So let's start with this. How do you get and let me just actually put in, part of this event is really to understand how you connect with people who are very different who come from someplace different than the history that maybe you're looking into. And I just want to know, how do you get your students to care about this history? What do you do when you teach this history now? You were talking about a little bit how you get this kind of start into this. So tell me a little bit about it.
Well, let me start like this. First of all, we are sort of comprehensive school. So that means that we have very different sort of students, not just high school students. I think that's important to know. And I'm convinced that most people on the world, never mind the age or the color of the skin or whatever, learn more or less the same way. Because I think that we learn better if we can connect things we see, we hear, which are new for us, with things we already know from our own life and because of our own history. And if you look at my class, my class at the moment are 25 students. There's only one girl whose family is originally from Germany. All the others come from Turkey, Arabic countries, Africa, what else, Balkan. So they don't have a German history, if you say like that, if you want to say like that. Sure. And so I think it makes no sense if you talk about, if you want them to learn about history, about the past, just to focus on Germany as a country. But you have to connect, you have to give them the chance to connect their experience to what they hear. So what I did recently was I brought 7 folders to them. Each folder was telling the story of people who were deported not deported, who was persecuted by the Nazis. but not in Germany, but in other countries who were occupied by the Germans back then in the Nazi era. So it was about Greece, about Turkey. Turkey was not occupied, but still, it was, about Poland. What else? About a black boy in Nazi Germany.
So an Afro-German?
An Afro-German,
Yeah.
yes, sorry. Yeah, an Afro-German. And the students were asked to choose one of the folders. And it was quite interesting for me that every student choose a folder which was about their country their family comes from. Like a Turkish girl choose about Turkey, the Afro German choose about the black boy, and I've got a refugee girl coming from the Iraq. She belongs to the Yazidi.
Yazidi. Yeah, I know. It's a hard one for Americans to pronounce too. Go for it.
Okay, Yazidi girl from Iraq. And afterwards, after she worked with the folder, she told her classmates about the boy. This was a Jewish Polish boy who fled from the Nazis, more or less all around the world, by foot, by boat, by train, by horse carriage. I think you say.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, and he ends up in Palestine at the end. And while she was telling about that, I think everyone in class was thinking about her story, because she came from Iraq and she had to walk over the mountains of Iraq to come to the Turkish border. She had to take the boat to come to Italy, and we all knew that she was nearly dying by thirst. Yeah, when she went over the mountains, that she nearly drowned.
Right, on the sea. Yep.
On the sea, yeah. And she didn't mention her own story with a single word, but still I think she was, of course, thinking about herself as well. And I'm pretty sure that she won't forget the story about the Polish Jewish boy who had a similar experience than her. So what I'm telling this to you because I think if you want the students to have a deeper understanding of the Holocaust, I think we have to start at their own stories, because then it's easier for them to feel what it was like in the past. So either by nationality or the country, or what I did as well is that we were telling the story about two teachers who had to leave our school in 1933 because they were Jews, and we made a play about these two about these two teachers, and afterwards the students said it had such an impact on them to know that in the building where they learn today there were these two teachers, and they had to leave because they had a religion which was somehow not allowed. That's what they said. It was not allowed to have this religion.
Gotcha.
And religion means a lot for the students. So they are very how do you say, they show a lot of respect towards religion. And I think somehow they understood at that time that being Jewish is not a nationality, but it's a religion. And it's important for them to know that, because it's still something they can't really believe. For them, Jews are Jews and not Germans or not French or whatever.
So you mean that's sort of where they start, and it's a realization that you sometimes see. Can I ask also, my understanding is that there's some other benefits of this approach in terms of just understanding that there were Jews in these different places? Meaning that the students don't always know that there was a Jewish community in Turkey or in these other countries.
They didn't know. No, that's what I mean. I do think that they learn a lot because, for example, the folders I gave them, they were all documents, the original documents. It wasn't and real stories. So they know they learn about the people, and at the same time they can connect it with their own biographies, and so they learn that Jewish people like them, that they have the same fear than them. Some of my students are refugees, as I said. They have similar experience than the people they read about, and yeah, that's.
No, it makes sense. And I guess maybe let me just finish this line of thought, which is, my understanding is that the technique you're using now, the one you just described, is relatively new for you, that it's something that you sort of came up with after being in this visiting program with people like Steve. Or maybe some piece of it came up. And I just explain, maybe you could just explain a little bit about whatever the change was that came about.
Well, that I acknowledge and appreciate, or put it in focus, the history of the students. I did it for quite a while, since 7-8 years, since I built up this working group you were talking about earlier on. But the change for me was that when I was at the visiting program, I noticed that I always did it as a sort of door opener to make them ready for cope or to deal with a German history. And somehow I noticed at the visiting program, and when I met this American people, that it's not a door opener, but it's important that everyone, never mind the nationality or anything, brings their own experience into remembrance work. That is a part of it, and it's not just the entrance of it. And it doesn't, that you don't have to be German to do remembrance work. So that it's good to know about different sort of remembering culture in different countries, and it's even good to connect racism with anti-Semitism, because the students always do. There's always a point in our work when they start connecting their own. It's not just at the beginning, but at the end they say, well, this happened to me as well, or maybe that they compare. And I think for us Germans, it's always the difficult to compare, because we are always afraid that someone could blame us for that you can't compare the Holocaust with anything else. And that is I do think that it's possible to compare this. This doesn't hurt the uniqueness of the Holocaust. It's just that
But I think
for today.
but I think just to add a tiny bit, and then we'll move on, which is in a way, it sounds like this is a danger zone for somebody who's German, right? That the thing you really don't want to do is lessen the Holocaust by comparing it to something that doesn't make sense. But I think what I'm getting from this is that sometimes that concern means you don't compare to anything. And what I think what you're saying is, in the process of learning, not just as a door, but as students are getting into that, being able to connect and compare is sort of a key element of this.
Let me give you some example of what.
Please.
We went in 2017. We went to Poland, and we visited Majdanek and Treblinka and all these places. And it was very, it had a big impact on our students, or on my students. But at the same time, they had to face racism at that because of their looking like Muslim people. And I was really I was thinking, oh, that's it. Now they want to stop it. They want to go home, and they will never come back to my working group. And it was completely.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I just want to make sure people know. So when they said they faced racism, right, they were insulted, spit on, things like that, a couple of incidents at least. Yeah. Okay, keep going. I just want to make sure people understood what the situation was.
And this was completely the other way around, because at that moment, because they did remembrance work, they found it even more horrible, they didn't understand how this could happen. And they said, now we know how important it is to remember the past and to do this sort of work we do. They made it now, they really got the, how do you say, relationship to the past at that time.
Right. They sort of lived it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very helpful, thank you. Zabet, hold the next thought, because I'm going to bring you back after I've talked to Steve for a little bit. I have a couple questions for both of you. But thank you so much, that was great. Great. So I'm going to turn just moment for moment. We're going to go to Steve Becton. Steve, I'm going to call you Dr. Steven just for a moment. Let me just introduce Steve. Dr. Stephen Becton is the Chief Officer for Equity and Inclusion at Facing History and Ourselves. His organization uses history to challenge teachers and students to stand up to bigotry and hate. As an educator in Memphis, he has taught African-American teenagers and others about the Holocaust and helped them understand the roots and cost of anti-Semitism. He learned, hopefully we'll talk about this, in Memphis, that students from marginalized communities can often benefit directly from studying historic injustice that's beyond their communities, which is not actually an obvious point. So we were lucky enough to have Steve with us in June last year in the visiting program, where he was able to see a whole range of work by Obermeyer Wardies and other members of our network, to visit a lot of things in person, and also to interact with members of our network at our annual forum in the summer. That brings all sorts of members of our network together. And we were lucky enough to be able to have him present to us, which is what this image is. So Steve, thanks you for joining us. And I'm wondering if we could just start with the most obvious question to me, which is, why is it helpful to teach Jewish history and the Holocaust to young kids in Memphis? Not obvious at all. So please tell us why.
Yeah, so it is reasonable for one to think, if you're going to go into a classroom, when I first taught the Holocaust, I went into a classroom of all African-American students in an all African-American community in Memphis, relative low socioeconomic. Just want you to see the kids, relative low socioeconomics, right outside of the school, the community that has, food insecurities, housing issues, blight. And right in the midst of this, I'm coming in to teach a unit on Holocaust and human behavior. And this was, it's reasonable for one to think those students that I just described can more benefit from learning, quote unquote, their own history, right?
Sure.
History of racism, marginalization, and slavery, and in the U.S. context. And so it's reasonable for one to think that's the history you should start with those students. I learned, actually, amazingly learned that the opposite was actually true. The students primarily, and I heard this frankly even from my own children, studying the Jim Crow South and studying slavery or studying the fight for freedom, especially those periods of violence and terror and lynching. That's very traumatizing for young Black kids. It's also, and these were high school students, it produces a degree, a bit of shame. They don't want to be associated so much with the victimization that comes with that history. It's a bit yoking. So there's resistance. So what I learned with starting with the Holocaust, another people, another place, right? Another, for them, another time, another people, another place, gave these students sort of social and emotional safety to enter in these conversations about how do we create the other, who gets to determine who deserves equal protection under the law, who gets to determine who's fit to live and who's human and who's not human. So to explore those questions in the context of the Holocaust, in particular, looking at the rise of the Nazis in Germany,
Mhm.
was actually a fascinating intellectual journey that these students really leaned into. And then they were able to say, there's some interesting connections to our own experiences. And they entered the conversation around racism in America and legacies of slavery in a whole different and a more thoughtful way. So I found that to be very, very fascinating.
No, that's great. Thank you for that. Like I said, it's not obvious.
Yes, it's
You know,
not.
maybe I guess once you experience it, it's obvious.
Yeah.
Let me ask the second question that sort of fits this, which you started into a little bit, which is how do you get? I'm going to ask this. I'm going to ask this as a Jew, actually, which is how do you get people who are not from a Jewish background, who really whose background is so different, to care about this history?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, there's a idea that people you know can study the Holocaust and not even care about Jews. Like they're interested in the history, not Jews themselves. So how do we get people to care about this history, to get the people to empathize and care about people? So one of the things that we believe in our work at Facing History and Ourselves is that some people, we don't want to presume that some people are just more empathetic than others. Empathy is a skill. Empathy is a skill that can be built. And in good teaching of history should involve some intentional building of empathy. And how do we do that? We build empathy by humanizing folks. So we make sure to talk about Jewish identity before we even talk about the Holocaust, before we talk about the failure of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust, before we even get into the 20s and 30s and 40s. Yes, we just ask the question, who are the Jews? Who are the Jews of Germany? Who are the Jews in our own community here? It is not unlikely for the students that I mostly taught to go their whole K through 12 education experience and never encounter a Jewish person. It's very, in fact, in Memphis, that's a high probability.
And there is a Jewish community in Memphis. It's not that
there is a Jewish community in Memphis, but the chances of these particular students interacting with that community, unless there were some intentional interactions, which we did at Facing History, we made those interactions intentional. Unless there was intentional interactions, students just wouldn't know. So we need to build empathy. We need to humanize, and students begin to say, "Hey, these are people just like me. You know, they have a different fate, but they care about the same things. They have children, and their kids are like us, and they think about the kinds of things." So this sort of humanizing experience, one, and then the other thing is the relevance piece. I heard Sabbath talk about this, right? What is the relevance to these students' own lived experience? Why is studying the Holocaust? What are those why is it relevant to me as a Black kid growing up in Memphis? What are those connections? And to give them the space to make those connections and make it relevant to their own lives is the key to this, getting them to care about it.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of the story you told me before, just briefly, about studying the book about a teenager who joined the Hitler Youth.
Yes.
And the question of why. Why don't you fill that in just
this was one of those aha moments. You know, there are a lot of teachers on the line here and educators. You know, this is one of those moments when the students start teaching you something, and that's the best thing can happen in classrooms. But at any rate, we were studying the Hitler Youth, and the big question was, you know, sort of like, what was the appeal to Nazism? Why did so many German youth join the Hitler Youth movement? And we looked at the story of one youth, Alphonse Heck. Just a quick aside, pedagogical aside, it's great to always bring these down to one person story, one person experience. Because kids can't imagine, 5 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, or thousands of students joined the Hitler Youth. But if they can just listen to one student story. So Alphonse Heck he was an adult thinking back on why he joined the Hitler Youth. And he was a sort of a repentant adult that realized how horrible that decision was. But Alphonse Heck mentioned things like a sense of belonging, brotherhood, pageantry, protection, all these kinds of things, a sense of purpose, empowerment. So if you ask teenagers today why they join groups, it's for those same things. So Michael, one of my students, almost outed himself, but he just made a general statement. He said, this is why students in my community join gangs. This is the same reason. It's not so that we could perpetuate violence. It's for a sense of belonging. It's for a sense, this pageantry, this brotherhood, this connection. So Michael was going, wow, I can relate to Alphonse Heck. They went on to do this horrible thing called the Holocaust and genocide, but I can see how they were indoctrinated into anti-Semitism as 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids who were looking for this same sort of sense of belonging. So that was a fascinating connection that I didn't make for the students. They made it for themselves. And now they're hooked. They want to know how this turns out. Like, what happens next, in this narrative, because they see themselves in it.
Got it. All right. That sounds like a great way to bring them in.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one more question, since I asked this for Zabet, and then I want to bring her back in.
Sure.
Which is just, can you tell me a little bit about something that you got out of being on the visiting program? Zabet talked about this kind of perspective that she got. I feel like when we talked earlier, you talked a lot about physical spaces and about engaging people and places in an intentional way. But why don't you tell me, you don't have to tell me everything you got from the visiting program, but maybe just one nugget.
It's the question for me, is Zabet?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is there's a question for you. Zabet's going to.
Oh, I thought you were bringing.
No. So my question, actually, let's bring Zabet back. We can ask the question.
I'm sorry.
No, and you make sense.
And in true transparency, I'm also reading the chat. So I'm sorry.
That's fine. I wasn't quite sure what was going on. Here we are.
Yeah.
So here's my question. I'm going to start with Steve because I already put you on the spot for this, which is, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of one thing that you brought back with you from the visit.
Oh, so sorry.
Yeah, no worries. And you were talking about physical spaces and intentionality.
Yeah.
You just say it.
Yeah, no, it was just, I brought a lot back, but what was reminding me of the importance of getting out of the classroom and out of the rigor of the book and get into physical space. So like meeting Zabet's students at the train stop was so powerful. And so in the way that she used sort of project-based learning. I mean, I know about project-based learning and the learning beyond the classroom, and it's something that I do. But the way in which that's done there in Germany and the way that Zabet did it, and I saw other examples of this, it was just a powerful reminder. It reminded me that, just 10 miles or so from the school I was teaching at, there's a lynching memorial, right, of a man that was lynched here in Memphis due to racial terror. There was a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's one of the leaders of the KKK. There's a Ida B. Wells. There's the Civil Rights Museum there where Dr. Martin Luther King was slain, and how much we can use these sort of spaces and physical places in a more thoughtful way. And I just I saw a lot of that while in Germany. And then the other thing is, Joel, is those students that I saw there, Zabeth and other students, they had, to me, an even greater sense of responsibility to me to study the Holocaust than I feel from students here. And maybe that's because it happened in Germany. But I would even say more than white students want to grapple with racism in America. It seems like those German students wanted to grapple with the Holocaust much more than white students want to grapple with racism here. And I really, what I took from that is the intentionality in the way that you all do memory work there. Memory work is so intentional there, and it is so it's so a part of the fabric of education there that students, I think, embrace it and not a yoke by it. It seems as if they're even proud to do it. And so these are some of the couple important things.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And, and I would just say, as I think anybody on this Zoom knows, right, there's certain places in the United States where there's sort of a war on remembering going on right now. Zabeth, you don't have to respond to all of that, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about one or two things you took from the visiting program that have stayed with you.
Well, one thing I said before, you
mean about comparing the question?
About comparing, yeah. And for me, it was a bit similar, like to what Stephen said, that of course I knew about, for example, the Washington Holocaust Museum, and I knew about Remembrance work in the US, but still I was sort of surprised, or I didn't know how that there's a real remembrance culture in the US. And for me, I said it before that for me, remembrance work, remembering the Holocaust, was a German thing. Maybe people in Israel as well, but I didn't really think about. Even I worked for an organization, which Action for Reconciliation and Peace, who works in other countries as well. But even there, it was a sort of German perspective. We as Germans go to other countries to show that we do everything that it won't happen again. It's always that the Germans do something to remember or to make the world a bit better or whatever.
Yeah.
And at the visiting program, I first noticed that it don't have to be like that, and I don't think anymore that it's good to do it like that. That it's good to build bridges to other countries and to do the work together, especially because the generation after me, well, I met survivors. I could connect with through my family with the past, because my grandparents were Nazis, but my students, they don't have these relationships, and so we have to find different ways for them to cope with the past as well. And I think and do it in an international way is more. It's a better way for the future, I guess.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Let me just mention one quick thing, which is I think it's important for anybody on this call to know. I don't think, Zabeth, I'm pretty sure you would agree with this. I don't think anybody believes that Germans are the champions of memory, right? That everything's perfect around remembrance culture in Germany, and they've solved this problem, right? I'm exaggerating, right? We know it's variable all over Germany, and just part of the reason, Zabeth, you're here is, you won an award not because you were exceptional in many ways. And I'm not saying that other people aren't doing this work, but there's still a lot to be done. Yeah.
Hey,
and maybe
Steve, go ahead, Steve.
No, go ahead. Let me let Zabeth finish her thought.
No, I only was thinking, because you said, when I understood you right, Stephen, that you felt that the German students or the immigration background were sort of proud to do this work, or that it's even you felt that it was even stronger, their engagement. Somehow I think it's right that that students with an immigration background has more feelings for what it means to be persecuted. But
Mhm.
on the other hand, I think the student you saw was not a class; it was a working group, and some of them do this work since 2015. The older one, they are in the group for a long time, and I noticed that it really takes a long time to that they really feel themselves committed to the work. Some of them, they find it at the beginning just interesting, or they want to go into other countries and every things which are completely normal for young kids, I think. But after a while, like meeting people in different countries, seeing why people are engaged into this topic, makes them more and more that they understand what this work means for them and for their life as well.
Mm.
Interesting.
So Joel,
Mhm.
if you don't mind, Rachel raised something in chat, Rachel Green, that is very important.
Please go for it.
I hate to take us off maybe some of the goals you have for this conversation, but
Just go. I was going to go there anyway, so why don't you go now?
Folks teaching the Holocaust right now really need we all need to be grappling with this. Rachel is talking about resistance of African American students, and the pushback being that that Jews are white and they have white privilege. This is a phenomenon. This is something that's a growing sentiment here in particular in the U.S. And what I want to name is complicated, but one of the aspects of this is that this is a white supremacy sort of argument and movement, right? To lessen people's interest in anti-Semitism is to racialize Jews, right? To say that Jews are in fact white people who enjoy all the privileges and protections of whiteness, and therefore anti-Semitism is not all that critical, right? This is a really problematic reframe. And we as people that are teaching these histories are going to hear this more and more in classrooms, not just from Black kids. You're going to even hear this from white kids, and even some Jewish kids today might say this in the face of studying the Holocaust. So we need to grapple with this. And one of the ways that I've been doing it is to have kids to understand the complexity of sitting with two truths. Yes, a Jewish person who doesn't, if they don't identify themselves as Jewish, they can walk in a room, and if they present white, because there are Jews of color, let's remember that. But if they present as white, when they walk in a room, people see a white person and interact with them as such, and around all the privileges that comes with being white. So rather than saying, so that means that they're not persecuted people, we have to put an and there. There's a yes, and that person, when they go to synagogue, now probably have security outside of their synagogue, right? For the first time, because they are vulnerable. And if that person did decide to wear a head covering or identify themselves, they immediately become vulnerable. So it's a yes and we have to ask our students to sit with that tension of Jews as sometimes being accepted as white, but yet are totally vulnerable as a religious minority, and those things coexist. And the big question historically is, who gets to decide when Jews are white and when they're not? And if you study that history, that question has had grave consequences for Jews. So I just wanted to put that in our conversation.
No, that makes sense. Thank you, Steve. And I just want to confirm, you said the origin of some of this thinking is among white supremacists or white nationalists. Is that, I just want to confirm, yeah?
Absolutely. And because of most of this education and conversation is happening in social media, you have young Black activists, important. I'm not villainizing those young Black kids. They're activists. They fighting for justice, and they're hearing this narrative of these old Jewish conspiracies, like Jews are controlling money, Jews are controlling Hollywood. When Kyrie Irving got in trouble,
Sure.
people say, like, so Kyrie had to make some penance, right? He had to meet with a rabbi and all this. So the way a white supremacist would spin this is, hey, he offended the Jews, now he had to do this. Where had he offended some other groups, that wouldn't have happened. So there's a narrative that's being controlled by white supremacists. White supremacy, this is a whole nother conversation, but white supremacy, the basis of white supremacy and white nationalists and white extremism is anti-Semitism. It's not racism. They're racist, true, but the basis of it, if you really study the deep basis of white supremacy, nationalism, is anti-Semitism, and that's where those connections are being made.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Quick follow-up. Let me see if I can find it, because there's another question here that kind of fit in with that theme. And then I think I'm going to turn it open over to general questions in a second. So I'm going to go down this road just a tiny bit more. Stefan, thank you for this question. I think we're going to transition to just general Q&A now, since I see the time moving along. So here's the question. Steve, do you draw parallels, and if so, in what way, between Nazi racial theory between 1933 and 1945 and the movements of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and so on that are current in the United States? I assume the answer is you do, because you just did.
Yeah, it's the one of the things that we teach students about you all talk about comparing earlier, comparative history. It's okay to compare. People say, well, you shouldn't compare. It's okay to compare, but you compare without making what we call facile comparisons, right? We rarely say just like this is just like that. Let's ask ourselves a more nuanced questions, right? What are the legacies of that history that are present with us today? And what can we learn from what happened in the 1930s? And what are the echoes today, the warnings of that history that we're not heeding to today? A more nuanced question. We want to sit with the particulars of the Holocaust, right? And make universal connections. But sitting with the particulars is important. There is nothing like the Holocaust, but there are universal connections. There is nothing like Middle Passage, right? But there are universal connections to what it means to create the other. So what we ask students to do is to sit with the particular while making these sort of universal connections of what it means. Because if we don't see the patterns, if you study the Rwanda genocide, right, you will see the small steps of dehumanizing, creating the other, turning people against each other, making people out to be victims, making people not to be human. These same things that led up to the Holocaust led up to the Rwanda genocide, right? But is Rwanda like the Holocaust? No. But we can see some of the lessons of the Holocaust, and it would have told us when they first started othering the Tutsi and calling them less than human. Oh, history has taught us that could lead to genocide.
Right.
And that's what we do. So yeah, I see the comparison, the propaganda of the 30s. Propaganda is live and well today. The attack on teaching American history is a propaganda machine, right? That's full of lies and libels and myths.
Yeah.
And playing on fears. Exactly what was happening in the 30s.
Great.
Yeah.
Great that it was happening, but thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
So look, I had a provocative question, but I'm going to skip it because I see the time, and I think we should go to questions from others. I think Rebecca, am I right? Rebecca, you're going to be answering some of them, or not asking some of them. So let's pull you on here and let's ask a few more questions.
Great. All right. Well, we have a lot of very interesting comments that have been made, and some questions as well. So the first one I want to go to is from Nir, who mentions that anti-Semitism is in the US is on the rise, and I would say, in unfortunately, globally. And much of it is perpetrated by elements of the extreme right. How do you reach youth susceptible to extreme right ideology with a message of tolerance and compassion to help reduce anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred? And I would love to hear from both of you how you see this.
Sabbath, I'll give space for you to go first on this one.
No, please, you start.
Zabit, I want to make sure, Zabit, just the speed of the speech, did you follow the question well?
Not really. It was too fast for me.
I thought so. Rebecca, why don't you just ask it one more time? And we'll give a little
Sure.
time to think.
Yes, let me just pull it up. So essentially, anti-Semitism is unfortunately on the rise. We're seeing that globally. How do we help young people maintain their, compassion, their tolerance, and help to reduce the rise of anti-Semitism and racism and hatred? What are some ways that we can reach young people?
Well, Stephen said something about that when I got him right, that every time when something's happening with the Jewish people, they say, well, if it would happen to a Black people, nobody would say anything. I think this is quite similar what my students say sometimes when they hear about anti-Semitism, that they say, well, they do care about the Jews, but they don't care about us, about Muslim people. And to work against anti-Semitism in Germany means first of all, that the students meet Jewish people, because they don't know them. There are no Jews in their, well, they live in their communities, and I would say even the German Christian people don't know Jewish people, most of them, and they don't know about their life. And so quite often what we did, well, the best thing we ever did was, of course, I took some students to Israel, and this actually was the, you can say, birth of the working group Remembrance, because it was for them the first time that they part of a Jewish community, and they saw that it is possible to as a Muslim to spend time together with Jew people. And they actually said before we went that they were sort of afraid of going to Israel because they didn't know what could happen there. And they came back and they said, it is possible, and it's not possible, it's fun to be in Israel, and there are so many similarities between Jewish religion and our religion as well, and they don't see no sense anymore why they couldn't live together. And before we went, there was always the argument between if we talk about Palestine or if we talk about Israel. And when we came back, or even at the trip, they said, we don't talk about Israel or Palestine anymore. We call it the Holy Land, because for us, it's the land of all Christian religions who live there. And I think this was a big effort. And of course, unfortunately, I can't take all the students to Israel, but to let them know about Jewish religion, to get them to know Jewish people, it's important for. So before I start teaching the Holocaust, I always do a unit 1 year before where we talk about Jewish religion. And I saw Itai in the audience. He's always coming and talking to the students about it, and he takes them to the synagogue. Thank you for that, Itai. And yeah, I think it's. I said before that my students are for them, religion is very important, and they do react or act respectful towards religion. And I never, for me, I don't know, Itai must say, but I never experienced that students were disrespectful when they heard about Jewish religion. And so this is one point. And the other thing, which is very important for Muslim people, is to talk about Israel, because I said before that for them, being Jewish is mainly the nationality. And if they want to talk about Israel politics, they think they talk about Jewish, and for them it's hard to understand that, of course, you can discuss Israel, the politics of Israel, and you can criticize it, but this has nothing to do with the people, with Jewish people. And so what I did after what I do usually after teaching the Holocaust is that I talk about the foundation of the state Israel, and that because there are so many facts they don't know, because they only know what they hear from their families, from the Arabic medias. So that there are a lot of lies, really lies they don't know. And you were talking about aha effect. We have this word in German as well. For them, it's aha effect to hear about the foundation of Israel and the way the conflict developed, because they only see they only know the Islam, the Arabic point of view or perspective, and not the Jewish or the Israel perspective. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zabet. That was great. I don't know, with that kind of lead-in, Steve, do you want to, is there anything you want to say related to that question?
No, I just want to underscore one thing Zabet said, because her answer was so thoroughly on point. And that is, it's relationships, right? To me, the inoculation of anti-Semitism and racism to me is relationships. One of the things that we did, Memphis is, like a lot of places, very segregated. There is a Jewish community here that's very, segregated from, the Black community in which I was teaching in. So one of the things that we've done at Face History ourselves is some intentionality of getting those students together. So y'all, we just really quickly, one way we did this, we did these things called teach-ins. These are powerful. Well, we invited students from all of these different communities, right? Jewish students, Black students, kids from private schools, kids from parochial schools, kids from religious schools, brought all these kids together in what we called a teach-in. We trained the students to be the teachers, maybe teach a lesson of the Holocaust, the students. And guess who the audience was? Their parents and their family members. And we brought them all to one school. And these kids were teaching, they were the teachers, while their parents are the students. And for the first time, many of these parents are, and we are in this Douglas community where I taught these all Black kids. Many of these parents, not just Jewish parents, our parents from all over Memphis, had never been to Douglas because there was no relationship. They had no reason to be there. We brought them all together, and the kind of sort of like human connections was happening. What I believe on a very basic level, now when you hear something racist or you hear something anti-Semitic, because I sat with that person and had a conversation and connected with that person, or you hear something like how bad that Black neighborhood is, and those kids are just bad and thuggish and violent. When you hear all these things in the news and social media, when you have had an experience with a person, you say, that's not true. I've been to that school, I met those kids and they're amazing. And when you hear something anti-Semitic, you go, no, that's problematic. I've met people from that community, and, so it's, to me, relationship, but that has to be intentional. That just doesn't happen. So the question for us who are fighting for equity and justice, how are we intentionally creating opportunities for people to be in relationship with each other? And that's got to be intentional.
Gotcha. I just want to point out, I can see the time. And so we're at the bottom of the hour that we said. I believe we were planning to go on for at least another 15 minutes. So anybody who wants to stick around for the continuum of question and answer and some of the things in chat, we invite you to do that. But if you need to leave, that's okay too. I just want to acknowledge that, and maybe we can just keep going. There's a lot of good questions here, some very provocative ones. Rebecca, I'll let you ask this one if you want.
Is there one in particular that you were looking at?
No, go ahead. If you're focused, go for it.
there are a number of comments just about Jewish identity, and I wanted to read just a few of them, and then get your take on ways that we can show the kind of multifaceted identity of any group of people, which you've touched a little bit on, but would love to hear if you have any additional thoughts. So Ed mentioned that, Jews get it from all sides. We're accused by some of having white privilege and by white racists of being Jews, and he's personally, unfortunately, dealt with racist taunts many years ago. And I'm sure in other ways. Marjorie mentions that it's important to point out that there are many non-white Jews. And then Judith commented about that both of the speakers have mentioned Jewish identity as if it's an inevitable and kind of reliable religious identity, but that is not true. Many Jews are not practicing the Jewish religion, and yet still identify as belonging to the Jewish people. So I just wanted, and Steve, I know you mentioned, you kind of responded to this in the comments, but again, would just love to hear a little bit more of your reactions about helping students to understand how, complex and layered Jewish identity, or really any identity, is, and especially because Jewish identity is often tied to the Holocaust. What are efforts that you've made to try to show contemporary Judaism or, Jewish life and Jewish people?
When we are doing our Holocaust seminar, we have a session that we intentionally named that a Jew is not one thing. And the whole session is about the complexity of Jewish identity, right? And who's Jewish, the face of Jewish, the experience of Jewish, even the complexity of just like any religion, even those that practice Judaism, that's not a monolith. So we really slow down to talk about this, but what I want to point out, and what Judith raised there, even in this conversation, we went to this sort of monolithic view of Jews through this religious definition. Everybody who wants to consider themselves a person doing work around sort of inclusion, whether it be Holocaust, race, or whatever, just own that we all operate in a deep amount of bias. I'm a chief equity officer. I talk about this stuff every day, but Steve Beckton operate in a deep amount of bias. And until we all willing to admit that, and call it in, Judith Levy, what you did is you didn't call us out, you called us in. And if those of us who do the work don't practice calling each other in and not getting defensive when somebody calls us in and admitting that we have this bias, how will we ever impact the people that are truly resistant of this? If those of us who are trying to be on the right side of these conversations don't own our own bias. So Judith, thanks for calling us in. So I would answer that by saying, own your bias, because these single story narratives are rooted in bias. And don't ask yourself, don't ask yourself, are you biased? It's a flawed question. Yes, you're biased. Ask yourself, how are my biases showing up? If all you knew about me was that I was a Black man that grew up in a single parent home in Memphis, if I told you nothing else, your brain is going to start telling you stories about who I am. That's how bias operates, right? So what do we have to do? We have to be conscious of that, and we have to actually say to ourselves, that may not be who Steve Beckton is. So let me really get to know him, because this narrative that's running through my head could be wrong, because it's based on stereotypes and bias. We all need to slow our brains down and do that work intentionally. And that would help us not to group anybody and assume any general identities about anybody. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Sabit, would you have anything to add just in terms of teaching the Holocaust in Germany, which, there is a growing Jewish population again, but still, especially outside of, I know you're in Berlin, but outside of Berlin, there's not necessarily a large Jewish population. People haven't necessarily met Jewish people. Is there anything to keep in mind in terms of teaching the Holocaust, or and tying it, making sure that people understand Jewish identity today?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
But let me jump in, because Zabet, I think it is worth just keeping in mind in Germany, there is a Jewish community, but it's small, and it's really not one community. There's a quote unquote organized Jewish community that has state support and tends to be, compared to the United States, for the same label, right? Orthodox, conservative, reform, tends to be more observant and much more rigid in Germany. And I think actually people who are part of that community would agree with me. Then, for example, in Berlin, there's a huge community of Israelis, some of whom are relatively secular Jews, some are practicing. But anyway, there's less Jews, but there's still, particularly community elements that are there. And it is true, when you have a small community compared to the amount of people who are in Germany overall, it seems like it would be good enough to get them exposed in a relationship with one person. But actually, one person generally isn't enough to see that there's a range there. And so, for example, one of the groups that we know only sends people in pairs, not because two people can represent a whole panoply of stuff, because they can't, but at least you'll see they're different. And they make sure they're very different. So
there is a big growing culture Jewish scene in Berlin, as I know, and I mean my students are not interested in them because they are not interested in this sort of culture. Never mind if it's Jewish or not, but I think it's more like Jewish identity, like we are Germans, we are Jews, and this makes a difference for other people. For example, for my children, it makes a difference for them to recognize, oh, there's a culture scene who call themselves Jewish, and they do it as Jews.
Gotcha. Rebecca, looks like you were teeing up the next thing.
Sure. So Alan mentioned that educational boards have restricted the use of certain books like Maus and the Anne Frank Diary and others. And Olivia asked, now that our schools are under assault, how can we educate our kids in this new context of where teachers and schools are being undermined in teaching history? Steve, this is obviously kind of a US context question, so we'd love to hear from you and how Facing History is addressing this.
Oh, it's so troubling, right? We don't have an easy answer, no more than any other organization. It's just so troubling. We doubling down on our support of educators. One, we're saying educators, we stand with you, right? So we're standing with educators, and we always were standing educators. But also, this is important. We are trying to help shape the narrative, right? So there is a narrative around the books, the teaching of history. I just to make my point, let me say something that Brian Stevens of the Equal Justice Institute says. He says that the South may have lost a war, but they won the narrative, right, of racial injustice and white supremacy. The South may have lost the war, but won the narrative. What I'm saying is that those of us who are on the right side of this historical moment, we need to start speaking more and more to shape the narrative. Because if the haters control the narrative, right, then parents are they afraid because they hear the narrative. They hear that we trying to indoctrinate kids. They hear that we trying to make their kids, trans. They hear that we're trying to call their kids racist. All of this fear mongering. What we who study history know that fear mongering has always been a tool of fascists, of racists, of Nazis, of any extreme group have always relied on fear mongering and controlling a narrative. So what we've been trying to do at Facing History, rather than sort of getting in an argument with that stance, is to continue to educate and to create the narrative around the work. right? And speaking to parents to say, here is the real goal of history. Here is the goal of this course, not to get defensive. We have a Holocaust book that's about this thick. And we've had parents go after one reading in the book. The book got 200 readings, and go after one reading and say, I don't want my kids to study that because of that one reading. You know what we do with that parent? Oh, come to the classroom and see how we use that reading. We have to open these doors, and I just want to say this. We have to be careful not to villainize and label all of these parents as racist who are afraid of these histories, because they are being fed propaganda. They are. And so we have to counter those narratives, right? And that's complex, but that's how we try and approach it.
Thank you, Steve. Troubling but powerful thoughts.
So there's a comment and a question from Alan, who mentions that he's found Holocaust education in Germany varies across the country and seems to have less traction in the former East Germany, where there is a rise in the far right and a strong support for the AfD, the most right-wing party. He says many of the gymnasium or high school websites just skip over 1933 to 1945 and make no reference to their former students. Sabit, I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit about the requirements of Holocaust education in Germany, and if you just how you see this the education around Holocaust topics covered. Either regionally or across the country.
Well, the big problem is really that there are many students who never hear about the Holocaust in class, actually, because many of the students leave school after the 10th class, and we are supposed to teach it in the 9th class, but usually we can't do it, and my class is in the 10th form at the moment, I teach it at the moment. But if I said, well, I won't teach about the reunification of Germany, because I've no time for it. So the problem about the school system is that we have much too less history class. It's only 1 hour a week, and we have between the 7th and the 10th form, we start with the middle age, and we have to be in the present at the end of the 10th class and form, and this is not possible. So this is one thing, and this is one reason one point that it's easy for teachers, if they don't want to teach the Holocaust, they can skip it easily by saying, I've got not the time for it. There are other topics I found more important, or they don't say nothing. Then there are people, teachers, as you said, in Eastern Germany who are already afraid. We just had the situation that there were teachers in East Germany who wrote a letter in public to the medias, that they said that they have extreme right-wing sided students in their school, and that they had several attacks at other students, and it came out that it happens for quite a while and nobody answered. The headmaster knew, the authorities knew before, but they didn't do nothing. So this happens already, and I think it's not just a problem about Eastern Germany. It's always easy to talk about Eastern Germany, but I think we do have this in the old West Germany as well. Maybe not in the big city like Berlin, but yeah, we do have anti-Semitism, of course, and we do have right-wing sided people as well, and we have the problem about students who don't feel themselves belonging to Germany, because they are still well, the Germans still see them as foreigners, and so they, if you be called as a foreigner their whole life, then you don't feel responsible what's going on in the country, and some of them are anti-Semitic because of that. I think that they turn into be radical, well, Muslim students here. We do have them, yeah.
Thank you. Joel, do you think we have time for one or two more, or?
Why don't we do, we're starting to wind down a little bit, why don't we do one more question?
Okay.
But it looks like we have a fair number of people who are still here, which is great.
Yeah.
So let's do that.
Okay. All right. So we've talked a lot around many of these different topics, but I'm sure there's more light we can shed. So Patricia asks, what are the principal reasons or lack of reasons for the current rise of anti-Semitism? And Steve, how is your approach, or perhaps it's the kind of facing history approach that you've been describing, been adopted across a wider spectrum of educational institutions in the US? Since this seems like such a commendable and positive methodology. And I'll mention that in the comments also, Ed mentions, is there really a rise of anti-Semitism? Or do anti-Semites now just feel that they have permission to express their views as a result of the rise of the MAGA movement and just far-right extremism in general? So Steve, perhaps you can talk a little bit about, I'm sure people would like to hear a little bit about how, how widespread facing history is. I know you work across the country, but
I think there is I think it's both. Yeah, I would just say quickly, I think it's a yes, and I think yes, because of there's permission for hate to come out, all kinds of hate to come out now. So I think, hatred in general has come out of the closet, because people have more permission to be hateful right now. And I do think there's a rise in that contemporary anti-Semitism. I absolutely believe that I think is fueled again by pop culture and the racialization of Jews and the pressing of old Jewish tropes, and conspiracies are coming back, and I just hear them, and so we've got to counter those narratives through education and conversations like this. So facing history in ourselves, we have the benefit of being around for a really long time. So we sort of are in many places and spaces, we're a trusted commodity. But most of our work, frankly, where we have our biggest imprint, it has been historically in more blue states, so to speak, right? So we are trying now to be more strategic around being more deeply in conservative enclaves, because those students, think about this, if students in these rural or more conservative enclaves are not having conversations that the Holocaust provokes, they become targets for extreme groups. They're in isolation, they're not part of a civil dialogue, and they become targets for hate groups. So it's extremely important to us to give facing history to all students, regardless of their sort of like political backgrounds and their families and all that. We are starting to experience some success with that. Example, Tennessee, the state in which I live, is votes red. I mean, and 3/4 of this state is pretty freaking red when you get beyond Memphis, right? And our legislature is very conservative, like almost turning back. I would say they've taken us back 10, 15, 20 years with some of, the attacks on history, on non-gender conforming students. All of this is happening here. But guess what that same legislature just did, you all, 2 days ago? They approved facing history in ourselves, Holocaust and behavior, Holocaust and human behavior curriculum, which is a semester-long elective taught in schools across Tennessee. That same conservative legislature approved our elective a couple of days ago. Why is that happening? Is because our approach at facing history and ourselves is really to create civil dialogue. We really do not believe that it's our job to indoctrinate kids. We don't believe it's our job to tell kids what to think about things. It's our jobs to create civil dialogue, to help kids be critical thinkers, to make up their own mind about fairness and justice, to make up their own mind about, for example, how would they think about Israel and Palestine? We don't tell them what to think. We give them rigorous content. We give the tools of inquiry. We help them to become critical thinkers, and we do something that's very important. We build their empathy and their moral compass. So we believe that when students are taught that way, they're going to lean toward equity, justice, and fairness. They just need the space to do it. So that's what we're doing, and that approach can be embraced by people that are maybe considered more on the right a little bit. Look, and there's some people we'll never reach. There are some people out there that are downright anti-Semites, they're downright racist, and there's nothing any of us will be doing to change their mind. Those are not the people we're after. There are a lot of more people out there that are confused, they're miseducated, they are frightened, they don't get it, and it's our job to create a dialogue in which they can come into and learn and grow as people.
Steve, thank you for that thorough answer. I know as a parent with two little girls, knowing that kind of work is going on.
Just a quick correction. Hey, Joel, I need to make a quick.
Please do it. Go for it.
I said it was the legislation that approved our elective. It's the education department, the state education department that approved our elective. So I want to name that. I do think those people are just as political, but it was a state education department.
And it makes sense. And I'll make one first. I really appreciate it again as a parent. And I would just say, we're aware that as wide the circle is, at least in terms of what's going on in Germany. I'm sure you are as well, Zabet. Getting curricula into schools in Germany is just much different and much harder. And one of our key allies, Widen the Circle's key allies, is the Amadeo Antonio Foundation in Germany, which does focus on a lot of these issues, but not as much directly with school curricula, because it's just a much trickier process in Germany. All right, I think we should wrap up, not because there are more things to find out, because this has been great, but because we've been at this long enough. First, I want to thank both of our guests. I want to thank Zabet Schmidhals, Obermeyer Wardy, and also for all of your great work. And I just want to mention that your students and you, through a different connection to the visiting program this June, will not be in the visiting program. You will be going to Oklahoma, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to look into remembrance work around the Tulsa Race Massacre with Carlos Hill, who's one of the participants in the visiting program. So anyway, congratulations on that, and we look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you. You will hear about it.
I sure hope. And then Steve Becton, I want to thank you so much for being part of this event. This was really great, and it was really heartening to hear some of the things you're doing and some of the ways you think about it. So thank you.
Glad to do it. It was such a rich conversation. I enjoyed being a part of it.
Wonderful. And I just wanted to point out, let me just can find my right notes here, which is that we do have an event. And I just had, like I said, give me a second here. Oh yeah, that's right, on June 10th. So for those of you who can join us on June 10th, we have our next event is actually going to be live from Berlin. We have participants in this year's visiting program, and some of the members of our German network are going to be meeting there in Berlin. Zabet and Steve were both part of this last year. And we'll have panelists from the US and Germany. We'll be exploring how addressing the past can change current narratives in the US and Germany, which is particularly germane especially Steve, after your discussion about the need to impact narratives. So with that in mind, I hope those of you will look out for our invitation for that event on June 10th. And just thank you to everyone, for our participants and for people in the audience for those thoughtful questions. And thanks again to Steve and to Zabet, and for everyone for those questions. We really appreciate you joining us. If you want to find out more about Widen the Circle, please come to our website at widenthecircle.org. Thank you.
Wow.